Wyprzewiczaki no wakrzaj do nowiny ogłukie śmiechna ko się odjeżdżały a kiedy te to na hecu ono wyciąga ektarka jest ja ojuksile wyciąga to na nie Lakota to na hecu iglon ja onko
You're hearing the voice now of Selena not helping. This is Selena. She's speaking in the Lakota language on Radio Keeley, Indian-owned and operated Lakota radio station on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And she's speaking in 1990, December 1990, about a ceremony that took place in December 1990 in commemoration of the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, in which 200 to 300 Lakota people were killed by the U.S. cavalry. Selena's grandfather was one of the survivors of the massacre, and she has devoted her life to telling the story of the massacre. She heard it from her ancestors. My partner Skip and I were in South Dakota in 1990, December 1990, in solidarity with the ceremony. We were assistants on a 7-day horseback ride across country to the Wounded Knee Massacre site. And we have a commitment to tell this story of our trip and of the Lakota people. A commitment that we feel very strongly that 500 years is enough. We don't want to see any more massacres. We don't want to see any more police beatings. We want to find a way that we can learn from the Lakotas about the healing that they're going through. This ceremony of theirs is called Wiping Away the Tears and Mending the Sacred Hoop. They're bringing their people back in the circle. We hope we can learn to come back in the circle as well. So I'm Louise Dunlap, Skip Shield. It's your turn, Skip.
Lakota people keep their history with pictures. It's called the winter count. Each winter, the people would gather and decide what the most important event of the year was. And then the artist would draw or paint on a buffalo hide or on a ceremonial teepee. And this is a man who is painting an edition in the late 1800s to an account that goes back about 100 years. Louise and I are going to adapt the winter count tradition of the Lakota people to give you a broader view of the history that the massacre and the Bigfoot rodeo ride fit into. Lights could go up, Eric. Yeah, they're coming up. 1492, a remarkable year. Exactly 500 years ago, Columbus landed the first of 4 times on the coast of the Western Hemisphere. There were approximately 80 million people in that area. Within a generation and a half, that number had decreased to about 2 million. A result of the disease that was brought over by the Europeans, the slaughter that the Europeans perpetrated as they looked for gold and other minerals, and mass suicide by the native people who couldn't tolerate the breaking up of their culture. 1492, within about 10 years, the slave trade was instituted. Columbus actually took the first step by bringing native people back to Europe. They died. Most of them died en route. The rest died there. 1505, Bartolome de las Casas, a young priest whose father had accompanied Columbus on the first journey, suggested, I have an idea. Instead of using these Indians, let's import Africans. And that then instituted the slave trade that we know. 1505. Within a year or so, de las Casas realized what he had done. And although he continued to be a supporter of Columbus, the enterprise, and the whole mentality of conquest, he saw the effects. And he relinquished his slaves and his gold fields, released them, and then began speaking out about the atrocities here. And his writings were published by 1520 and led to a controversy in Spain and Portugal and throughout Europe. I was in the Wordsworth bookstore recently and I found an edition of De las Casas, so if anybody wishes to read that, they can. 1505 to 1520. By 1530, the conquistadors were throughout Mesoamerica. Montezuma fell. 1675, the last armed uprising, as Medicine Story referred to, known by whites as King Philip's War. Late 1700s, the Cherokee people and others from the U.S. Southeast were forcibly relocated to Indian Territory, what we now call Oklahoma, culminating in the Trail of Tears in 1834. 40% of the people died on a forced march from areas of what we call now Georgia, Carolinas, Alabama, Mississippi, on their way to Oklahoma. In 1865, the Civil War ended. Imagine the situation. All that armament, all that personnel, and most importantly, the value system that had been established. What to do with all of those ingredients with so much force? Custer got his start in the Civil War. 1868, gold was discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota. An expedition was set out by the U.S. government to verify that find. Who led the expedition? George Armstrong Custer. Shortly before that, a treaty commission, the Fort Laramie Treaty, had established the Great Sioux Reservation, including an area, which included an area from the Missouri River west to the central area of Wyoming, and it did include the Black Hills. So within several years, gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and unilaterally, on the part of the U.S. government, the Great Sioux Reservation was shrunk down to about a quarter the size. 1876, Custer and his 7th Cavalry met a combined force of over 10,000 Cheyenne and Lakota people at the Little Bighorn River, and were annihilated, most of them. By the 1880s, the buffalo had been wiped out, partly a result of the trains going through, carrying hunters with big guns, satisfying the appetites of whites and whites in the eastern part of this country and in Europe for buffalo tongue. The buffalo were the source of food, clothing, shelter, and ceremonial objects of the Lakota people. One major act of resistance that the Lakota designed was the ghost dance. It was an amalgam of Christian practice and belief and native spirituality. Based in nonviolence, the teaching was, if we dance in a certain way, sing in a certain way, the earth's surface will roll up and take with it all the whites, their trains, their guns, the cavalry, and bring back the old ways, the elders who died, the buffalo, other elements of the traditional Lakota culture. So by the late 1800s, 1889, ghost dancing was at its height. Headlines read, these are papers on the plains. Sitting Bull rises again. The Redskins about to attack. The whites, inflamed by the press, even then it was happening, interpreted the ghost dancing as a preparation for war, and they demanded that troops be sent out. Sitting Bull, one of the leaders of the Lakota people living in the northern section of South Dakota, was arrested one morning, December 15, 1890. And in the process of arrest, Indian police killed him, instigated by the Army. Sitting Bull's people were terrified and decided to flee south and meet with Red Cloud and others at the Pine Ridge Agency in Council, decide what to do. So December 15th, 1890, that group of people set out, going south. December 22nd, 7 days later, they met up with Bigfoot's people. Bigfoot was an elderly chief at the time, known as a peace chief for his abilities to reconcile people, and his people joined. And the combined group of about 300 or 400 then with a few horses, a few warriors, but mostly elderly people, children, and women, walking in the middle of winter, continued on down to the Pine Ridge Reservation. They were intercepted by the Army and told to camp along a creek called Wound Knee. On the morning of December 29th, 1890, they were forced to disarm. They had very few weapons. The soldiers went into the tents, went to the teepees, and under the blankets, and sometimes under the clothing of the women, to take out from them any possible implement they could use as a weapon, including kitchen or food preparation knives and leatherworking awls. A shot rang out. Nobody knows exactly who fired, for what purpose. And then that huge force of 7th Cavalry and others opened fire with Hotchkiss cannon and rifles. As Louise mentioned, approximately 300 people were killed. About 25 soldiers lost their lives, probably in crossfire. And within a short period of time, 15 of the soldiers of the cavalry have been given Congressional Medals of Honor for their valor. 1900, the nadir in population and spirit of Native people. Most folks at that time thought either the Indians are going to die out or they're going to become totally assimilated into white culture. But now the story changes in tone, partly a result of Black Elk, who some of you may have read in Black Elk Speaks. Black Elk was a boy at the Little Bighorn, young man at Wounded Knee, and met with Richard Neihart and told the story of his people, which included the prophecy of the 7th generation. Many people, including Wampanoag and Hopi and others, have prophecies that speak of a recycling. And in the case of the Lakota, the belief that Black Elk spoke of was in the 7th generation after the Wound Knee Massacre, the people would have a chance, and the last chance, to come together again, to rebuild the nation, to mend the sacred hoop. They didn't do it then, they blow it. That 7th generation is alive now. That's the young leadership of the Lakota Nation, and one of the main reasons the Bigfoot Memorial Ride was held. 1937, Black Elk Speaks was published. 1960s, a volatile time. Many of you lived through that. Opposition to the war, the end of the civil rights movement, the decimation of the black leadership. But out of that ugliness and despair arose Indian resurgency. 1969, the American Indian Movement was formed. Dennis Banks and others founded it. They occupied Alcatraz Island a succession of times. One of those times led to a motor caravan across country, 1972, called the Trail of Broken Treaties. Ended up in Washington, D.C. with an occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs because nobody from the government would talk with the Indians. 1973, traditional people on the reservations in Lakota lands saw the oppression that was continuing and the continuing broken treaties, and invited in AIM and others. And that was the occupation of Wounded Knee, 1973. An armed confrontation lasting about 2 months. 1975, 2 FBI agents were killed on the reservation. The movie, now playing Thunderheart, is about that period. And Peltier and others were nabbed. Peltier was the only one that was brought to trial finally. He was convicted and now serves 2 consecutive prison terms. Some of you may have been here just last Tuesday when we were able to speak directly with Peltier, who's in prison at Fort Leavenworth, via a phone hookup that my friend Stuart arranged. 1975. 1978, another cross-country journey, this time the trail of the longest walk, from Alcatraz Island to Washington, D.C., to protest a whole string of anti-Indian legislation that was being propounded. 1986, people on the reservation are thinking, aha, we're coming up on the centennial of Wound Knee. What are we going to do? What would you do if you were the person in that situation? They knew the prophecy. They decided to retrace the path taken by Bigfoot and his people. 14 days, approximately 250 miles by horseback, and do it 5 times. So 1986 was the first of the 5 rides. 1990 was the last one, the culminating ride, which you'll see the slides about. Now we're almost here. 1992, kairos, a Greek word meaning moment of opportunity, crisis. What can we see as a result of peering into this history? Numerous walks and runs are being conducted now by Native people and their supporters throughout the Western Hemisphere to commemorate what they think, what I think is a truer view of the Colombian legacy. Information on the table out there during the break. 1993, the beginning of the next 500 years. How do we change individually and as a culture as a result of hopefully a new awareness? So with that as background for the slides, here we go. First, the land, the Great Plains, not flat, really, filled with undulations, variations, details, and can only be appreciated if there, if standing on it, walking on it. The sky, 360 degrees. Am I watching the here? Okay. I can do it too. 360 degrees, so you can see the storms coming and receding for hundreds of miles. Yes, we set up the projector so that we can get a full horizontal, but we're not getting full verticals. And you can imagine the rest of the picture. Very cold, very cold. Several times down to 30 below 0 Fahrenheit with strong winds bringing the wind chill down to about 70 below. Wind blowing continually from the north, snow falling, but the wind is blowing so strongly, that it never builds up. However, we can always tell which direction is north by looking at the shadows made by the snow. Massacre site. People fled into that dry gully to escape, or tried to escape. The largest area is the Great Salt Reservation. Then after the Black Hills and other regions were taken away, 4 years later down to that middle section, and then by 1890 down to the Black area, which is essentially what this size is now of the reservations. Rosebud, Pine Ridge, and others. Bigfoot's people had a dance. Not a ghost dance, but looked a lot like this. Photographers prominent out there. This is a much photographed region. Sitting Bull. Went on tour with Bill Cody to Europe, but continued as a strong leader of his people. Advocated the ghost dancing. The route taken by Sitting Bull and Bigfoot's people starts off the screen up north and continues down to about, where you see Eagle Butte, that's the midway point, joined by Bigfoot's people, and then down to Wound Knee. That's the same route of the ride. Soldiers and officers of the 7th Cavalry at the time of Wound Knee. The newly designed Hotchkiss cannon, not fully field tested yet, rapid firing, explosive shells, highly accurate. The morning, December 29th, disarming the people. And some of the warriors tried to intervene between the army and the people. For 3 days, a blizzard covered up the bodies and prevented the burial, and then a crew was sent out and found the people frozen in postures of death and from the cold. The medicine man, who some felt exhorted the Lakota to resist the army and led to the first fire. Can't see his face, unfortunately. That's Bigfoot, propped up, I learned recently, by the photographer who made this picture. He was one of the first to die, and it was under a white flag truce. These photographs mostly come from a book recently published called Eyewitness of Wounded Knee. About 70 of the 300 bodies were dumped into this mass grave, which looks approximately like this. And this was the terminus of the ride. A marker at the gravesite: Chief Bigfoot, Mr. High Hawk, Mr. Shading Bear, Long Bull, White American, and others. A fairly accurate depiction of the events, but if you notice the word massacre in the title has a line, a thin white line to the right of E. That's a plate that was put on over the original title, Battle of. So the, I think this was state government sign, did make that change from battle to massacre. Massacre, battle massacre, yes. However, the official state map of South Dakota still calls this the site of the Battle of Wounded Knee. Trail of Broken Treaties, 1973. An armed confrontation. The Indians had some weapons. The military representing the U.S. government, the state government, and the tribal government were well equipped. 2 Indians died, several more were wounded. 1 Indian child was born. Dennis Banks, who at the time was an advocate of a violent resistance to white incursion. Supporters came from all over the country and also from Europe. People including Angela Davis and Reverend Ralph Abernathy were there for a while. And that occupation is one type of resistance. Another type, represented by the ride, is more symbolized by the circle, the bringing together of people. The teepee is constructed in a circle. The opening to get in and out is a circle. The bird's nest is a circle. The seasons form a circle. The earth is a circle. The sun and moon are circles. Life itself is a type of circle, the life of an individual. The teepees and the tents were always put in circles. And one of the emblems or logos of the Sneetanka Oyate Wapixwe, Bigfoot ride, was a circle. So we were constantly reminded of the healing power of the circle. You're now going to hear the voice of Dale Looks Twice, who was the program manager of KILI, the Indian radio station.
There, from the beginning of the ride, which you would have seen with the Sneetanka riders, first of all. And in the middle, there's a medicine man named Orville Looking Horse. And Orville holds a staff, which is like a cane. And the staff has many feathers on it. The year before the ride, the riders went up there and put their feather on the staff. So what that meant was that rider had to be drug and alcohol free and live the traditional Lakota way, walk the red rope for a year until the ride started again, and every year thereafter. Because you have spirits watching you day in, day out, with the feather and also with the pipe. for these people to go up there to stop and hang their feather up and say, okay, well, I made a commitment to walk the red road.
The horses also were given eagle feathers. So each morning after the prayer circle and a speech by one of the medicine men or other leaders about the theme of the day, each day a different theme. Women, children, the elderly, the infirm, people in prison, the environment, peace. The riders would all shoot off. And many said that riding for them was a type of prayer. Brought them into close contact with four-leggeds and with the earth. Some would ride alone, some would ride together, sometimes they would ride over cross country, sometimes along roads. The cart symbolized the presence of Bigfoot himself, who was carried in the cart because of his illness. Some walked in solidarity with the riders. This is Emma Featherman Sam and her niece. Emma was a student of Louise's and was one of the reasons we got to Wound Knee. And they were walking in solidarity on that particular day. Runners from various parts of the country appeared also in solidarity with the riders. This particular group is from Wisconsin, and they've run in places like the former SSSR. Louise also has been a solidarity runner. When she saw him coming, she could not resist. A short segment of the run downhill. The support group was very important. Louise and I had the job of running an emergency medical vehicle. Families were helping, horses had to be cared for, food brought in each night by the community. We used a lot of gas, and remember this was right at the outset of the Persian Gulf War. On this particular day, we supported the ride at Kinky's gas station in Manderson, South Dakota. The owners of the gas station lowered the price to $1.68 a gallon. We had trouble starting our vehicles. This particular van needed a double jump. This truck, operated by some fellows from Germany, who were also riding and camping in Keepy, had on this particular morning congealed oil. So they lit a fire under the crankcase and then were able to jump start it. Indians have a fine sense of humor. So one day we found this. 250 riders from 18 Indian nations lined up on the ridge, and at a cue all came down together. In that group was Shirley Crazybull. She's wearing the red bandana. She'd had a lot of problems in her life. She's from the Rosebud Reservation. Her name was formerly Shirley Jones, but she turned to the native way, to the traditional ways. She's now a sun dancer, and she's ridden on 4 of the 5 Bigfoot rides. Not all days were as dramatic as that one. This was more and more. Cold, windy, dark, snow and ice building up on the hoofs, forming little cones on the bottoms of the feet. Horses getting sick, many of them of pneumonia. 4 of them died. They would hack throughout the night. They would play out as this horse has. On the next to the last day, or approximately, we came to the Badlands. Bigfoot and his people traveled through here. They had no support group. They had no extra vehicles. They were not going to be met by members of the community with food. And they had to find a way across. The park department has put up a marker, which you might notice includes an earlier picture of Bigfoot. What would be the effect had they chosen that other picture to show? We camped each night, either in school gymnasiums, where people were gathering, we hadn't seen each other for long periods of time, and bringing out ceremonial objects, special objects like star quilts. Food played a big part in this, as I mentioned, brought out by the community generally, always featuring buffalo stew, a sweet dessert called wojapi, fry bread. Some fasted and drank only herb tea for the first 4 days. Other nights we camped out. That's me setting up our tent. Feature of the outdoor camps was the bonfire after we'd all eaten. And Louise, talking circle would form around the fire, and
Okay, the talking circles usually took place on the theme of the prayer for that day. So the prayer might be for the elderly, for the youth, for the sick, for the environment. On this particular night, it was for the women. So people had prayed all day for the women, and at the end of the day, the men fixed a supper for the women, and the campfire was all women speaking. As the talking stick was passed around, the women would speak about their role, their experience in bringing together the culture, in trying to mend the sacred group and wipe away the tears. So we'd like to play you the voice of a woman speaking at the campfire, so you see the kind of feeling that would come up in these very expressive moments.
The first evening that we camped, I was about halfway asleep, and I was looking out towards the campfire, and little by little there were fewer and fewer people. And all of a sudden I saw all this activity around the campfire. And there's a lot of people with long black hair. They look different, not like us. Their eyes look like the way a deer looks when you shine the spotlight on. They were really shiny. So I know that the descendants of this Bigfoot massacre and the people who took this long journey by foot are here with us. Their spirits are all around us. And so when I come to things, gatherings like this where the spirits are really strong, I know my relatives are there with me, and especially in the sweat, I'm happy because they're there. And we change. And I love all of them.
some of the people that we met and learned from, we'd like to introduce you to now. This is Lloyd Bald Eagle, who was a Lakota man. He'd just broken in the horse. He hadn't completed the breaking in, so he wasn't sure he was going to be able to ride it. But after several days, the horse settled down.
And his stepson, Bibbergeese Nevins, a Micmac Indian person from New Brunswick, who was there with his mother. And we got to know him on the first day of the ride, which was the day for the children. He's 11 years old. We gave him a ride in our car, and because he didn't have a horse, but he was very clever and found himself a horse. Enjoyed the ride.
Joshua Marshall, also age 11, rode the entire way, 2 weeks, all the way from Sitting Bull's death site to Wounded Knee, and was very profoundly honored in the 3 days of powwows after the ride.
Riding on his own horse. Oh, Shirley.
Yes.
This is Shirley Crazy Bull again, and if you could see her face, it's it looks in pain, and she was in pain. She was suffering from frostbite of the ears.
A TV producer who found herself without a job because of a last-minute cancellation, but she rode anyway in solidarity with the ride.
Ron McNeil, teacher at Oglala Lakota College, another enterprise on the Pine Ridge Reservation, very articulate spokesperson for the ride, who reminded us on one occasion about the meaning of being in the circle and the sharing of goods, and as he put it, Indian people were the first socialists.
Jessica Hunting, a white woman from Seattle, heard about the ride about 8 months or so before it was to happen, had never ridden a horse, found a place to learn riding, implored her mother to be her support person, came out, and the two of them as a team rode the entire second leg. She now has slides of ours and slides of her own, and is making the rounds of the Seattle schools with the story of the ride. John Carr, a Jesuit brother that I met 10 years ago on one of my first trips out there at the St. Francis Indian Mission. He's from Wisconsin. He is not an Indian, but he speaks Lakota, looks Lakota, and like a lot of the clerics, has dedicated his entire life, what remains of it, to the people. His specialty is small-scale technology.
Oscar Bearrunner, who was present at the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973 and was telling us about it.
Dennis Banks, who you met earlier, had a conversion as a result of being very close to a group of Japanese Buddhist monks and nuns, and he realized the value of nonviolence. Now his primary work is organizing and conducting sacred runs, and he has one now going throughout the Western Hemisphere, converging in Santa Fe on October 12th.
The last day of the ride, as we entered the Wounded Knee area, the sign says, entering Wounded Knee District, respect Mother Earth, do not litter. I had decided to walk with a large group of people led by George White Thunder and organized by some of the Japanese Buddhists. We were walking through weather that the radio said was 60 below with the wind chill. It was very, very cold. We had that wind coming at us from the north. People wrapped in their blankets. We grew for this last day. People from all over the world, really. This is Jun-san, Jun Yasuda, a Buddhist nun whose order has dedicated itself to walking for peace. She's fasted and walked for peace all over the continent and other continents, especially in solidarity with Native people. She had brought other people from Japan to be part of the ride and walk. This is Maru. He's a rock musician, former rock musician in Japan, who had also come on the longest walk with Jun-san in 1978. Atsuko, a Japanese journalist. As we were coming along the road, someone looked back, and we could see Porcupine Butte, where the radio KILI is located. And we could also see that the riders were coming along behind us on the road. And we knew that they would be passing us very soon. First the leaders with the eagle feather staffs, and then the entire group of riders coming along quietly, but their presence was really intense. You could definitely feel the spirit, as at all times that day. And shortly after they passed us, we headed down the hill into the Wounded Knee Creek area. Just before we got there, we ran into this man whose relatives had pushed him to the end of his driveway so that he could join us in going into Wounded Knee. Very deep feeling of everyone in the area area, to be part of this occasion, to be part of this ceremony that was coming up, whatever the cost. As the walkers reached the area of the massacre, we had a small tobacco ceremony led by the Ojibwe holy man. The symbol that's being carried is a special kind of staff with a dream catcher, and that's Dennis Banks holding the staff. This was our destination, the monument.
The flag on the left has the 4 colors of the directions, red, yellow, black, and white. Also, the 4 colors of the races. And the photograph is badly overexposed, no doubt. We found that frequently we would have trouble with our equipment. At times, coincident when we were at certain places. And there we were, at the site of the massacre and the mass grave, having all of our equipment problems. The wiping away of the tears ceremony was held right at the gravesite and only could be attended by descendants of survivors and victims of the massacre. So we all had to stay outside, but we could hear the eagle blowing whistle being blown, the drumming and singing, and we heard later what had happened, that people had found ways to connect with their ancestors and finally end that period in a ceremonial way of mourning. The riders then circled the gravesite, and each was smudged with a combination of burning sweetgrass and cedar. And the final circle. Always those staffs so prominent in the feathers. Ron McNeil in the red coat, and little Josh Marshall on his own white horse. And then 3 days of powwow. The leaders, Burnell Whitefeather, Jim Garrett, Virgil Killswice, and Orville Looking Horse. Virgil talked to us about the 4 traditional Lakota virtues: generosity, wisdom, fortitude, and courage, and asked, now you've been able to embody these virtues on the ride, what happens when you go back to your own lives? Orville Looking Horse is the keeper of the sacred pipe, which the Lakota believe was given to them many, many, many years ago by a white buffalo calf woman, along with the teachings. The drumming and the singing, calling all of us to dance. June song. Constant reminders with the eagle feathers of the spiritual forces. A type of hoop is the family. That's Emma Featherman Sam with her mother, her niece, her granddaughter, and her sister. And drawing back just a little bit, all those people are part of Emma's extended family. Lakota words are mitakiasin, all my relatives, often said at the end of prayers and speeches. Emma's son Cullo being honored for completing the second leg of the ride with his 2 cousins. And then we were all asked to shake everybody else's hand in a circle. And the way we did this was, the leaders began the line. Then people joined by going to them, shaking their hand, and going behind, forming a longer line. So little by little, if you can imagine this, everybody in that hall, numbering about 500 people, finally shook everybody else's hand, got in line, and formed a snaking circle, filling the gym. Mending the sacred hoop.